New York City draft riots. On July 13, 1863, New York City exploded in violence. The Union draft had just begun, forcing working men into the Civil War. Resentment turned into rage, and mobs swept through Manhattan. What started as a protest against conscription quickly descended into racist terror. Black New Yorkers were beaten and lynched. Homes, businesses, and even the colored orphan asylum were set ablaze. For 4 days, the city burned. Federal troops, some rushed in straight from the victory at Gettysburg, were called to restore order. By July 16th, the streets were littered with destruction. At least 119 people were dead. More than 2,000 were injured, and New York's black community was permanently scarred. The draft riots remain the deadliest civil uprising in American history, proof that the battles of the Civil War were not confined to the front lines. Great Railroad Strike of 1877. On July 14, 1877, in Martinsburg, West Virginia, railroad workers walked off the job after the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut wages for the third time in a single year. What began as a local strike quickly exploded into the first nationwide labor uprising in U.S. history. The strike spread like wildfire, paralyzing rail lines from Maryland to Illinois and Missouri. In Pittsburgh, state militia opened fire on crowds, leaving about 61 people dead and destroying over 100 locomotives and more than 1,000 rail cars in the chaos. In Reading, Pennsylvania, clashes known as the Reading Railroad Massacre left 10 to 16 civilians dead. In Chicago, the Battle of the Viaduct cost at least 14 lives, and in Baltimore, dozens more fell in brutal confrontations. By the time federal troops were deployed to restore order in early August, over 100 people had been killed nationwide, thousands were injured, and millions in property had been reduced to ashes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was more than a protest. It was a warning shot. It showed the raw power of organized labor, the deadly force of industrial might, and the deep fractures that would shape America's labor battles for decades to come. Los Angeles riots. On April 29, 1992, Los Angeles erupted after 4 LAPD officers were acquitted in the videotaped beating of Rodney King. The verdict sparked outrage, and what began as protests spiraled into 6 days of violence. Crowds filled the streets. Looting, arson, and deadly clashes spread block by block. Entire neighborhoods went up in flames as firefighters were attacked, forced to retreat while the city burned. Local police were quickly overwhelmed. The California National Guard, the U.S. Army, and the Marines were deployed to restore control. By the time order returned on May 4th, 63 people were dead, more than 2,300 were injured, and over 12,000 were arrested. Property damage soared past $1 billion. The Los Angeles riots weren't just about one verdict. They exposed decades of racial tension, inequality, and mistrust between communities and law enforcement. 30 years later, one question remains. Has America truly moved forward, or are the cracks that split Los Angeles in 1992 still waiting to erupt again? By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'll greatly appreciate it if you could show support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Detroit riot. On July 23, 1967, in Detroit, Michigan, a police raid on an after-hours bar known as a Blind Pig sparked an uprising that would become one of the deadliest in American history. Within hours, anger over years of police brutality, segregation, and poverty erupted into the streets. Crowds clashed with officers, fires spread across neighborhoods, and the city descended into chaos. For 5 days, Detroit burned. Looting and gunfire swept through the city as more than 9,000 National Guard troops and 4,700 U.S. Army soldiers moved in. Tanks and armored vehicles patrolled residential blocks, turning Detroit into a war zone. By July 27th, the human toll was devastating. 43 people killed, 33 black and 10 white, over 1,000 injured, and more than 7,000 arrested, Nearly 1,400 buildings were burned or ransacked, leaving scars across the city that would last for decades. Attica Prison Uprising. On September 9, 1971, Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York erupted into chaos. Nearly 1,300 inmates seized control of the prison, demanding better living conditions, political rights, and dignity in a system they said treated them like less than human. For 4 tense days, negotiations played out under the eyes of the nation. Inmates pressed for medical care, religious freedom, and fair wages. Hostages, guards, and civilian employees were held as bargaining chips. The standoff grew heavier with each passing hour. The yard transformed into a battlefield of fear and defiance. On September 13th, the state made its move. Helicopters dropped tear gas as troopers stormed the prison with rifles, shotguns, and live ammunition. In a matter of minutes, the uprising ended in carnage. At least 43 people were dead, 29 inmates and 10 hostages killed in the retaking alone. The images shocked America. Families mourned, investigators raised questions, and a spotlight was cast on the brutal realities of the U.S. prison system. Attica became more than a rebellion. It became a symbol, a warning about what happens when justice is denied behind closed walls. Watts riots. On August 11, 1965, in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts, a traffic stop involving 21-year-old Marquette Fry and his mother escalated into a confrontation with police. What began as a single arrest quickly grew into a clash between officers and residents. Years of frustration over poverty, discrimination, and heavy-handed policing boiled over. For 6 days, from August 11th to 16th, the streets of Watts were engulfed in violence. Businesses were looted, entire blocks went up in flames, and thousands of National Guardsmen were deployed with rifles and tanks to restore order. When the smoke finally cleared, the toll was devastating. 34 people dead, more than 1,000 injured, over 3,400 arrested, and property damage exceeding $40 million. The Watts riots marked a turning point in American history, forcing the nation to confront the explosive consequences of inequality and racial tension in its own cities. Chicago Race Riot. On July 27, 1919, Chicago's segregated beaches became the flashpoint for one of the deadliest racial uprisings in American history. 17-year-old Eugene Williams, a black teenager, drifted on a raft into an area claimed by white swimmers. He was pelted with stones from the shore, struck, and drowned. When police refused to arrest the white assailant, anger erupted. Within hours, street fights broke out between white and black residents, quickly spreading across Chicago's South Side. For 8 days, the city descended into chaos. White gangs roamed through black neighborhoods, while black defenders organized to fight back. Homes and businesses were burned, mobs clashed openly in the streets, and gunfire echoed through the city. By the time order was restored on August 3rd, the toll was devastating. 38 people had been killed, 23 black and 15 white. More than 500 were injured, and as many as 2,000 black residents were left homeless after arson attacks destroyed their homes. The violence was not an isolated event. It was part of the Red Summer of 1919, when racial clashes swept across the United States, exposing the explosive tension between segregation, job competition, and migration. New Mexico State Penitentiary Riot. On February 2, 1980, the New Mexico State Penitentiary near Santa Fe erupted in violence. Within minutes, inmates overpowered guards, seized weapons, and took control of entire cell blocks. For the next 36 hours, the prison descended into chaos. Prisoners armed themselves with power tools and makeshift weapons, targeting both staff and fellow inmates. Rivalries turned deadly, and hostage guards were beaten and terrorized. When authorities finally regained control on February 3rd, the toll was staggering. 33 inmates were dead, more than 200 others were injured, and 12 officers had been taken hostage. The facility itself was left in ruins. The New Mexico riot remains the deadliest prison uprising in U.S. history. It exposed severe overcrowding, poor conditions, and deep flaws in the correctional system, problems that demanded urgent reform. Nat Turner's Rebellion. In late August 1831, Southampton County, Virginia, became the site of the deadliest slave rebellion in American history. Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher who believed he was divinely chosen to lead his people to freedom, organized a small group of followers. On August 21st, under the cover of night, they began moving from plantation to plantation, killing slaveholding families as they went. By the time the rebellion was suppressed on August 23rd, about 55 white men, women, and children had been killed. The response was swift and brutal. White militias and armed mobs retaliated, killing dozens of enslaved and free black people. Historians estimate that up to 120 were executed or lynched, many of whom had no involvement in the revolt. Turner himself evaded capture for more than 2 months before being found on October 30th, 1831. He was tried on November 5th, convicted of leading the insurrection, and executed by hanging on November 11th. The rebellion sent shockwaves across the South. Lawmakers passed even harsher restrictions on enslaved people, limiting assembly, literacy, and religious gatherings. Fear and repression deepened, but so too did the rebellion's legacy as a symbol of resistance against the institution of slavery. Nearly 2 centuries later, Nat Turner's actions remain one of the most controversial chapters in American history. German Coast Uprising. On January 8, 1811, in the Orleans Territory near New Orleans, hundreds of enslaved people launched what became the largest slave revolt in United States history, the German Coast Uprising. The movement was led by Charles Deslandes, a mixed-race overseer who organized enslaved men from nearby plantations. Armed mostly with cane knives, axes, and a few firearms, their numbers grew to between 200 and 500 as they marched along the Mississippi River. They set plantations ablaze, destroyed crops, and demanded freedom, while white planters and their families fled in fear. The rebellion lasted until January 10th, when territorial militia and U.S. Army troops confronted the rebels. The fighting ended quickly. Only 2 white men were killed, but the response was devastating. About 95 enslaved rebels were killed in battle or executed afterward. Many of their leaders were decapitated, and their heads were placed on pikes along the levee from New Orleans to the plantations as a warning to others. Although crushed, the German Coast Uprising exposed the deep resistance to slavery and the lengths enslaved people would go to seek freedom. More than 2 centuries later, it remains the largest and one of the most brutally suppressed slave uprisings in American history. Pullman Strike. In May of 1894, unrest erupted at the Pullman Company in Chicago. Workers faced sharp wage cuts while rents in company-owned housing stayed the same. The injustice ignited one of the largest labor strikes in U.S. history. By June, the strike had spread across 27 states, with more than 125,000 railroad workers refusing to handle Pullman cars. Trains carrying U.S. mail stopped moving, and the nation's commerce froze. President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops into Chicago to restore order and keep the mail running. But when soldiers arrived, violence exploded. Rail cars were set on fire, streets turned into battlegrounds, gunfire echoed through the city. By July, at least 30 people had been killed in Chicago alone. Historians estimate as many as 70 were dead nationwide, with thousands more injured. The strike was crushed, but the bloodshed forced the nation to confront the power struggle between labor, industry, and government. Out of this tragedy, Congress sought to ease tensions by creating a new holiday. Just months later, Labor Day was established, not as a simple celebration of work, but as a reminder of lives lost in the fight for workers' rights. Wounded Knee Massacre. On December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, the U.S. 7th Cavalry carried out what became one of the deadliest massacres in American history. The Lakota Sioux had gathered there after months of tension surrounding the ghost dance movement, a spiritual practice that U.S. authorities feared was a call to rebellion. The army surrounded the camp of Chief Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, and ordered the Lakota to surrender their weapons. As soldiers began confiscating arms, a struggle broke out. A shot was fired. Historians still debate from which side. Within moments, the troops opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns positioned on the surrounding ridge. The attack quickly turned into a slaughter. Warriors, women, and children were struck down as they tried to flee. By the end, an estimated 150 to 300 Lakota were dead, their bodies scattered across the snow. The U.S. Army lost about 25 men, many likely killed by their own crossfire. The Wounded Knee Massacre marked the violent close of the Indian Wars. Colfax Massacre. On April 13, 1873, Easter Sunday in Colfax, Louisiana, a political standoff during Reconstruction erupted into one of the deadliest massacres in American history. Dozens of black freedmen, many of them Union veterans, gathered at the parish courthouse to defend Republican officials elected with their support. Outside, a white paramilitary force of several hundred men, many aligned with the Democratic Party and the Ku Klux Klan, surrounded the courthouse, determined to seize control. Gunfire broke out, and after hours of fighting, the courthouse was set on fire. As the building burned, the defenders tried to surrender. Instead, they were shot, executed, or hunted down in the surrounding fields. By the end of the day, as many as 150 black men were killed. The Colfax Massacre shattered the fragile promise of Reconstruction. Only a handful of attackers were arrested, and in 1876, the Supreme Court's decision in United States versus Cruikshank overturned their convictions, ruling that the federal government could not prosecute individuals for racial violence. This decision left black citizens across the South vulnerable, signaling that federal protection of their rights had collapsed. The massacre marked a turning point, where the hopes of Reconstruction were violently crushed. Elaine Massacre. On September 30th, 1919, in Phillips County, Arkansas, black sharecroppers gathered at a church near Elaine. They met to form a union, seeking fairer prices for their cotton. That night, armed white men confronted the meeting. Gunfire erupted, leaving a white deputy dead and sparking panic. Almost immediately, local officials and newspapers spread the claim that black residents were plotting an uprising. Over the next 3 days, white posses, joined by federal troops, stormed through Elaine and the surrounding countryside. Black families were shot in their homes, hunted through fields, and killed without mercy. Historians estimate that between 100 and 240 African Americans lost their lives, while only a handful of whites were killed. In the aftermath, more than 100 black men were arrested. Many were tortured into giving false confessions. 12 were sentenced to death in rushed trials. It took years before the Supreme Court in Moore v. Dempsey, 1923, overturned those convictions, recognizing the trials as unconstitutional. Tulsa Race Massacre. On May 31, 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, an arrest over a disputed encounter in an elevator sparked unrest. By evening, white mobs had gathered outside the courthouse where a young black man was held. Tensions exploded into gunfire and violence spread into the Greenwood district. Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street for its thriving black-owned businesses, soon came under attack. Armed groups set fire to homes, looted stores, and shot residents. Eyewitnesses reported planes dropping incendiaries as the destruction intensified. For nearly 24 hours, Greenwood burned. Official records listed 36 dead, but survivors and historians estimate that between 100 and 300 black residents were killed. Over 1,200 homes and businesses were destroyed, leaving thousands homeless. No one was ever held accountable. Insurance claims were denied, and survivors were left to rebuild without compensation. Generational wealth that had taken decades to build was wiped out in a single night. Vicksburg Massacre. On December 7, 1874, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, less than a decade after the Civil War, the promise of Reconstruction stood on fragile ground. Black citizens had exercised their new rights, voting in elections and helping to seat a black sheriff, Peter Crosby. But white supremacist groups, led by the so-called Taxpayers League, were determined to erase that progress. On December 2nd, they forced Sheriff Crosby to resign at gunpoint. When hundreds of his black supporters marched days later to restore him to office, they were met with violence. At the courthouse, armed white mobs opened fire. By nightfall, at least 25 black men and one white man lay dead. The violence did not stop there. Over the following weeks, white paramilitary bands swept through Vicksburg and the surrounding countryside, targeting black residents in their homes and fields. The official coroner counted just a few dozen dead, but later investigations and eyewitness reports suggest a far higher toll. Anywhere between 75 and 300 African Americans killed. Only 2 white men died. Federal troops eventually returned to Vicksburg and reinstated Crosby in early January 1875, but the massacre had already delivered its message. Black political power in Mississippi would be met with intimidation and bloodshed. Wilmington coup. On November 10, 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina, became the site of the only successful coup d'etat in United States history. A mob of armed white supremacists, organized by Democratic leaders, stormed the city to topple its multiracial elected government. They set fire to the Daily Record, the only black-owned newspaper in North Carolina, and opened fire in the streets. At least 14 deaths were recorded by the coroner, but eyewitnesses and modern research estimate the true number at 60 or more. By nightfall, the city's black leaders had fled under threats of violence. Wilmington's mayor, aldermen, and police chief were forced out at gunpoint. In their place, the coup's organizers declared themselves the new government. For decades, the massacre was mislabeled a race riot to disguise its reality. Today, it is recognized as a violent overthrow that destroyed a thriving black community and silenced democracy in North Carolina for generations. East St. Louis Massacre. In July of 1917, East St. Louis, Illinois, became the site of one of the deadliest racial massacres in U.S. history. Tension had been building for months. Thousands of black families had arrived during the Great Migration, seeking work in industry. But when factory owners used black workers to break white strikes, resentment exploded. On July 1st, a car of white men fired into a black neighborhood. That night, armed black residents shot back at another car, killing 2 police officers by mistake. The incident became the spark. From July 2nd to July 3rd, white mobs stormed through East St. Louis. They set fire to black neighborhoods, beat people in the streets, and gunned down families as they fled. Eyewitnesses described men, women, and children hunted and killed as homes burned behind them. The official death toll recorded about 48 people, 40 black and 8 white. But survivors and investigators at the time believed the real number of black victims may have reached into the hundreds. At least 6,000 were left homeless. The massacre shocked the nation. On July 28th, the NAACP organized a silent parade in New York City. 10,000 African Americans marched down Fifth Avenue in complete silence, demanding justice and federal protection. Memphis Massacre. On May 1st, 1866, in Memphis, Tennessee, just a year after the Civil War, the city became the site of one of the first great racial massacres of Reconstruction. It began when a scuffle between black Union soldiers and white police escalated. What followed was 3 days of unchecked mob violence. White mobs, many of them policemen and ex-Confederates, swept through black neighborhoods, shooting men, women, and children, burning homes, and looting freely. By the time it ended, 46 African Americans were dead, more than 75 wounded, and at least 5 women raped. Nearly 100 houses, 4 churches, and 12 schools, all part of the city's black community, were left in ashes. 2 white men were also killed. No white rioter was ever punished. Instead, the massacre left black families homeless and terrified, and the community's institutions destroyed. But its impact reached far beyond Memphis. Federal investigations exposed the horror, strengthening calls in Congress for stronger protections for freed people. The outrage over Memphis helped build momentum for the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship and equal rights under the Constitution. Ocoee Election Day Massacre. On November 2, 1920, Election Day in Ocoee, Florida. What began as a day of voting ended in one of the deadliest episodes of racial violence in U.S. history. For months, the Ku Klux Klan had threatened black residents to stay away from the polls. Yet men like Mose Norman and July Perry tried to exercise their right to vote. When Norman was turned away, white mobs began to mobilize. That night, armed groups descended on Ocoee's black community. Homes and churches were burned to the ground, gunfire tore through the streets, and dozens of black residents were killed. Estimates range from at least 30 to more than 60 lives lost. July Perry was captured, lynched, and left hanging as a warning. By the next day, Ocoee's thriving black community had been destroyed. Survivors fled, abandoning land, businesses, and homes that were never returned. For decades afterward, Ocoee remained an all-white town. The Ocoee Massacre is remembered as the single deadliest instance of Election Day violence in U.S. history. If you enjoyed this video, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.